The boy cried to a Hell's Angel. "They're beating my brother." What the biker did next shocked all. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, it is free, and it is the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or your country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The night air over Cedar Ridge felt unusually still, the kind of quiet that settles over a small American town after most people have gone home and the street lights hum softly above empty sidewalks. A long stretch of asphalt ran past a row of aging storefronts and a gas station that had already shut its lights for the evening. The faint smell of gasoline and cold autumn wind drifted through the parking lot, where a single motorcycle rolled slowly to a stop. The deep rumble of the engine faded as the rider cut the ignition, leaving the night wrapped again in silence. The man swinging his boot off the motorcycle was known around this part of the state as Daniel Callahan, though many people who recognized the black leather vest on his back simply called him Razor. The worn patch stitched across his shoulders carried the name of a motorcycle brotherhood that often made strangers step aside when they saw it coming down the road. Razor did not look like the kind of man children would run toward for help. His shoulders were broad, his beard carried streaks of gray, and the lines on his face suggested a life filled with long roads and hard lessons. Yet in the dim glow of the parking lot light, his eyes held a calm patience that most people never noticed because they were too busy looking at the leather and the tattoos. Razor had just reached for his gloves when sudden footsteps slapped against the pavement behind him. They were uneven and desperate, the sound of someone running without caring where they stepped. Before Razor could even turn fully around, a small figure burst out of the darkness from the direction of the narrow alley beside the grocery store. The boy could not have been more than 10 years old. His breath came in sharp gasps and his face was wet with tears that glistened under the pale street light. Dirt streaked across his jacket as though he had fallen while running. For a moment he froze when he saw the tall biker standing beside the heavy motorcycle. Fear flickered across his eyes. People in town often warned their children about men who rode machines like that. But the sounds coming from the alley behind him were worse. The dull echo of angry voices and the thud of fists striking something carried through the cold night air. The boy swallowed hard and ran the last few steps forward until he stood only a few feet from Razor. His small hands trembled as he pointed back toward the dark alley. "Please, mister, you have to help me. They are beating my brother." Razor did not answer right away. He simply looked down at the terrified child, and then slowly turned his head toward the alley where the noise of the struggle continued to echo against the brick walls. Something in the boy's voice was more than fear. It was the sound of someone who had already asked for help and had been ignored. Razor removed his gloves one finger at a time and set them carefully on the seat of his motorcycle. The night that had been quiet only moments earlier suddenly felt like the beginning of a story that none of them were prepared for. The boy stood close to the large motorcycle as though the machine itself might offer protection from whatever danger waited behind him in the alley. His small chest rose and fell quickly as he tried to catch his breath. Daniel Callahan turned fully toward the dark passage between the buildings, his eyes narrowing slightly as he listened. The night was no longer quiet. From somewhere inside the narrow alley came the rough sound of a young voice crying out, followed by the dull impact of blows striking pavement or brick. Razor had heard sounds like that before in places far from small American towns. He had heard them in crowded parking lots outside bars, in dusty roadside stops, and once many years ago in a narrow street during a deployment overseas. The difference tonight was the frightened child standing beside him. The boy wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket and tried to speak again, though his voice shook. "My brother's name is Lucas. They grabbed him when we were walking home from the convenience store. I tried to stop them, but they pushed me down." Razor glanced down at the boy carefully, studying the dirt on his sleeves and the scrape on his knee. The child had clearly tried to help his brother before running for someone stronger. "What is your name, son?" Razor asked in a calm, steady voice that carried none of the urgency of the moment. The boy swallowed and answered, "Ethan. Ethan Parker." Razor gave a small nod and looked back toward the alley again. The sounds had grown clearer now. There were several voices inside the passage, young men by the sound of them, loud and confident in the way people become when they believe no one will challenge them. Razor stepped forward 2 slow steps until he could see deeper into the shadow between the buildings. A flickering light from a broken security lamp revealed shapes moving near a stack of metal dumpsters. One figure lay on the ground while 3 others stood over him. Razor could not see every detail from where he stood, but he could see enough to understand the situation. The boy on the ground appeared slightly older than Ethan, perhaps 14 or 15 years old. He tried to shield his head while the other youths shouted at him. Razor did not rush forward. Instead, he remained perfectly still for a moment longer, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light while his mind measured distance, numbers, and possible outcomes. Years of experience had taught him that charging blindly into a situation could make things worse for everyone involved. Behind him, Ethan shifted nervously. The child clearly expected the biker to run into the alley immediately like a hero in a movie. But Razor knew that real life did not move like a movie. Sometimes the smartest step was the quiet one taken first. Razor crouched slightly so that he was closer to the boy's eye level. Ethan, I need you to stay right here beside the motorcycle. Do not go into that alley unless I tell you to. Do you understand? The boy nodded quickly, though fear still trembled in his shoulders. Razor gave him one more steady look, then straightened to his full height again. The wind moved softly through the empty street behind them, while the alley ahead carried the echo of another angry shout. Razor rolled his shoulders once, the leather vest creaking quietly as he stepped away from the motorcycle and walked toward the dark passage. The street light behind him cast a long shadow across the cracked pavement as he entered the mouth of the alley. The voices inside had not yet noticed him. For the moment, the men believed they were alone with their victim. That belief was about to change. Daniel Callahan stepped deeper into the alley with the steady pace of someone who had walked into dangerous places before and survived them. The broken security lamp flickered above, throwing uneven light across the brick walls and the scattered trash bins that lined the narrow passage. The air smelled faintly of oil, damp cardboard, and the sharp metal scent that often followed a fight. Razor moved slowly, his boots making almost no sound against the cracked pavement. Ahead of him, the scene became clearer with every step. Lucas Parker struggled on the ground near a rusted dumpster, trying to push himself backward while 3 older boys surrounded him. One of them laughed loudly as he shoved Lucas back down with the toe of his shoe. The laughter echoed harshly against the brick walls of the alley. Razor stopped just inside the circle of light and studied them carefully. The one doing most of the talking appeared to be the leader. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a red jacket and the careless confidence of someone used to getting his way. The other 2 hovered nearby like shadows waiting for permission to move again. Lucas tried to sit up once more, but a hand pushed him back to the pavement. His breathing sounded strained, but he was still conscious and aware of what was happening around him. Razor watched quietly for a moment longer. None of the 3 youths had noticed him yet. Their attention remained fixed on the boy at their feet. The leader leaned forward and spoke in a mocking tone. You should have minded your own business, kid. Nobody asked you to watch anything tonight. Lucas shook his head weakly and tried to crawl backward again. I did not do anything, he said. I was just walking home with my brother. The tall boy scoffed and kicked a loose piece of gravel toward him. You saw too much, that is the problem. Razor heard those words clearly and felt something tighten deep in his chest. Situations like this rarely started with nothing. There was always a reason someone ended up in an alley surrounded by angry people. Behind Razor, the faint glow from the street light stretched across the pavement and reached the edge of the alley like a silent witness. Somewhere behind him, Ethan Parker waited beside the motorcycle exactly where he had been told to stay. Razor could almost feel the child watching from the darkness with hope and fear mixed together. Razor stepped forward one more pace and finally spoke. That is far enough. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of quiet authority that filled the narrow alley instantly. The 3 youths froze and turned toward him. For a moment, none of them said anything. They simply stared at the large man standing in the dim light with his leather vest and steady posture. The leader narrowed his eyes and glanced at the patch across Razor's shoulders. The grin on his face faded slightly, though he tried to hide it. What is this, he said slowly. Some kind of hero ride coming through town tonight. Razor did not react to the remark. His attention remained on Lucas, who was now watching him with a mixture of confusion and relief. Razor crouched slightly and spoke without taking his eyes off the group. Lucas, can you stand? The boy tried to move, but pain forced him back against the pavement. I think so, he said quietly, though it was clear he was not sure. Razor gave a small nod and rose to his full height again. The leader shifted his stance and took a step closer, as though trying to reclaim control of the moment. This does not concern you, old man, he said sharply. Walk away and nobody gets hurt. Razor looked at him calmly. That answer did not satisfy the leader. But Razor had already decided something important. He was not leaving this alley without both Parker brothers walking out beside him. The alley fell into a tense silence after the tall boy spoke. The words "walk away and nobody gets hurt" still hung in the air like a weak attempt at control. Daniel Callahan did not move. He stood with his weight balanced and his eyes steady, the kind of stillness that came from years of knowing that the next few seconds in a confrontation often decided everything that followed. The three youths watched him carefully now. Whatever confidence they had shown moments earlier had begun to thin once they realized the man in front of them was not afraid. Razor did not raise his voice. He did not step forward with sudden aggression either. Instead, he spoke with the same calm tone that had filled the alley before. I am not here for trouble. I am here for the boy on the ground. That is all. The leader in the red jacket scoffed loudly, as though trying to convince both his friends and himself that the situation was still under his control. He spread his arms slightly and glanced at the other two beside him. You hear that, he said with a short laugh. The biker thinks he gets to walk in here and give orders. One of the other boys shifted uneasily and glanced at the leather vest again. The symbol stitched across the back was not something people in Cedar Ridge usually challenged. Still, the leader stepped closer to Razor, as if refusing to lose face in front of his friends. The boy on the ground is our problem, he said. You should mind your own road and keep riding. Razor looked past him toward Lucas, who was trying again to push himself into a sitting position against the dumpster. Lucas winced, but managed to lift his head. His eyes moved between the three youths and the stranger who had stepped into the alley. There was confusion in his expression, but also something else now. A fragile thread of hope. Razor spoke again, without raising his voice. Lucas, your brother, is waiting outside. Ethan is safe. The words seemed to steady the boy on the pavement. Lucas nodded weakly, as if that single piece of information mattered more than anything else happening around him. Behind Razor, the leader let out a sharp breath of irritation. You talk too much, old man, he said. Nobody asked you to be part of this. One of the other boys muttered quietly to him that maybe they should just leave, but the leader ignored it. Pride had already pushed him too far forward. Razor noticed everything. The tension in their shoulders. The way one of them kept glancing toward the street, as though already thinking about leaving. The way the leader stood a little too close, trying to prove something. Razor had seen this pattern many times before. Young men trying to look bigger than the moment required. He shifted his stance slightly, and finally took one step closer to Lucas. That movement changed the energy in the alley immediately. The leader reached out and placed a hand against Razor's chest to stop him. The touch was meant to be a challenge. Do not take another step, he warned. For a moment, Razor looked down at the hand resting against his vest. Then he slowly raised his eyes again. The calm expression on his face had not changed, but something deeper had settled behind it now. I asked you once to stop, he said quietly. I will ask you one more time. Move aside and let the boy stand up. The leader hesitated. The alley felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the moment. Lucas leaned weakly against the dumpster while Razor and the three youths stood facing each other under the flickering lamp. Somewhere at the mouth of the alley, Ethan Parker waited beside the motorcycle, hoping the stranger he had trusted would not walk away. Razor remained exactly where he was. The choice now belonged to the boys in front of him. The alley remained locked in that fragile moment where nobody moved, yet everyone understood that the next action could change everything. The tall boy in the red jacket kept his hand pressed against Daniel Callahan's chest, as though the contact itself proved he still controlled the situation. The other two youths stood a few steps behind him, their earlier confidence fading into uncertainty. Razor lowered his eyes briefly toward the hand resting against his vest, and then slowly looked back up at the boy in front of him. His voice remained quiet, but it carried a weight that settled over the narrow alley like a warning storm rolling in from the distance. I gave you a simple choice, he said. Step aside and let the boy stand up. The leader forced a laugh that sounded thinner than before. You think that vest makes you the law around here, he replied. This is none of your business. Lucas shifted weakly against the dumpster. Behind them, the pain in his ribs made every breath shallow, but he forced himself to watch what was happening. The stranger standing between him and the three youths had not shown anger or fear. Instead, the man seemed completely steady, like a stone planted firmly in the middle of a rushing river. For a moment, Lucas wondered why someone he had never met would risk stepping into a situation like this. Razor gently but firmly lifted the leader's hand away from his chest and set it aside as though removing an object that did not belong there. The motion was controlled and calm. There was no sudden violence in it, yet the message behind it was unmistakable. The leader stared at him with surprise and anger mixing across his face. "You do not get to touch me," he snapped. Razor finally took another step forward, which placed him directly between the youths and Lucas. His broad shoulders blocked their view of the injured boy behind him. The flickering security lamp above them cast shifting shadows across the brick walls, while the cold night wind carried faint sounds from the empty street outside the alley. Razor crouched slightly and spoke over his shoulder without taking his eyes off the three youths. "Lucas, I want you to try standing again. Take your time." The boy nodded weakly. Using the edge of the dumpster, he slowly pulled himself upward. Pain flashed across his face, but he managed to get one foot under him. That small movement seemed to ignite the leader's temper completely. He stepped forward again, his voice rising sharply. "I told you to stop," he shouted. One of the other boys grabbed his sleeve nervously and whispered that they should leave before this got worse. But pride had already taken hold of the leader. He shook the hand away and glared at Razor as though the entire alley had become a stage where he could not afford to look weak. Razor watched him carefully. In another time, in another place, he might have walked away from an argument with a stubborn young man trying to prove something to his friends. But tonight there were two frightened brothers involved. That changed everything. Lucas managed to stand fully now, though he leaned heavily against the dumpster for balance. Razor turned slightly and extended a steady hand toward him. "Come here," he said. Calmly. Lucas took a slow step forward and gripped the offered hand. The strength in Razor's arm helped him move away from the corner where he had been trapped. The leader watched this happen, and his face tightened with frustration. "You think you are some kind of hero," he said bitterly. Razor looked at him without anger. "No," he answered quietly. "I am just the man who showed up when someone asked for help." The words hung in the cold air of the alley while Lucas stood beside him, trying to steady his breathing. Behind Razor, the faint glow from the street marked the path back to where Ethan Parker waited beside the motorcycle, hoping his brother would walk out alive. Lucas Parker leaned heavily against Daniel Callahan's arm as they began moving slowly toward the mouth of the alley. Each step was careful and uneven, but the important thing was that Lucas was no longer on the ground. The cold night air brushed against his face as he tried to steady his breathing. Razor remained calm and focused, supporting the injured boy while keeping his attention on the three youths behind them. The leader in the red jacket stood frozen for a moment, as though he could not quite believe what had just happened. The situation he thought he controlled had shifted quietly out of his hands. Anger flashed across his face as he watched Lucas move away from the corner where they had trapped him. "You are not walking out of here," he shouted suddenly. His voice echoed sharply through the narrow alley. The two boys beside him looked uncertain now. One of them stepped back a half pace as though realizing the moment had grown far more serious than they expected. Razor did not turn around immediately. He guided Lucas another step forward toward the open end of the alley where faint light from the street waited. Only when Lucas had taken that step did Razor slowly turn his head and look back at the group behind them. The calm expression on his face had not changed, but something in his eyes had hardened slightly. "You have already made enough mistakes tonight," he said quietly. The leader shook his head and stepped forward again. His pride had pushed him past the point where walking away felt possible. "You think you can just come in here and take him," he said. You do not know what he saw. Those words made Razor pause. He studied the young man more carefully now. The sentence confirmed what he had already suspected when he first heard them speaking earlier. Lucas had witnessed something these boys did not want anyone else to know about. Razor shifted his stance slightly, so that Lucas remained shielded behind him. "What exactly are you afraid?" he saw Razor ask calmly. The leader did not answer right away. His jaw tightened as if he had already said too much. One of the other boys whispered urgently that they should leave before anyone else came near the alley. But the leader ignored him again. Lucas looked up weakly at Razor from behind his shoulder. "I did not mean to see anything," he said quietly. "Ethan and I were just walking home." Razor nodded slightly, though he did not look back at him. "That is enough talking for now," he said in a steady voice. "We are leaving." The leader stepped forward again as if trying to block their path, even though they were already closer to the alley exit. His voice dropped to a tense whisper, filled with frustration. If he talks, everything changes. Razor finally turned fully to face him again. The street light behind them illuminated the alley entrance now and cast long shadows toward the three youths. Razor's voice remained level as he spoke. Then perhaps the problem tonight is not the boy who saw something. Perhaps the problem is what you chose to do where someone could see it. The words struck harder than any raised fist. The leader hesitated. In that moment, the sound of a motorcycle engine starting somewhere out on the quiet street drifted faintly toward the alley. Lucas shifted slightly beside Razor and looked toward the light at the alley entrance. From where he stood, he could now see the silhouette of his younger brother Ethan waiting anxiously beside the large motorcycle. Ethan had not moved an inch from the spot where Razor told him to stay. When Ethan finally saw his brother standing and walking toward him with the tall biker beside him, relief spread across his face. Razor noticed it too. He turned back toward the three youths one final time. "Tonight ends here," he said calmly. Then he guided Lucas forward again toward the open street where the younger brother waited and where the quiet town of Cedar Ridge was about to witness something none of them expected. Lucas Parker and Daniel Callahan stepped out of the alley and into the pale glow of the street light that stretched across the empty parking lot. The cold night air felt different out here, wider and calmer than the tight shadows behind them. Ethan Parker saw them first. The moment his younger eyes recognized his brother standing beside the tall biker, his entire body moved at once. He ran forward across the cracked pavement with the desperate speed of someone who had spent the last few minutes imagining the worst possible outcome. "Lucas," he shouted as he reached them. Lucas tried to straighten, even though pain still tightened across his ribs. "I am here, Ethan," he said quietly. "It is all right." Ethan wrapped his arms around his brother carefully, afraid of hurting him, but unable to stop himself from holding on. Razor stood beside them for a moment, watching the reunion without interrupting. The street remained empty except for the single motorcycle parked near the curb and the faint hum of a distant highway somewhere beyond the town limits. Lucas placed a steadying hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I told you to run and find help," he said softly. Ethan nodded quickly, though tears still clung to his face. "I thought nobody would believe me," he admitted. But he did. Ethan glanced up at Razor with a mixture of awe and lingering fear. Razor gave him a small, reassuring nod. "You did exactly what you needed to do," he said calmly. "Now we need to make sure your brother gets checked by a doctor." Lucas tried to take another step, but his balance wavered. Razor immediately placed a supportive hand under his arm again. The alley behind them had gone quiet for a moment, as though the three youths inside were deciding what to do next. Then the sound of quick footsteps broke the silence. Razor turned his head slightly and saw the leader in the red jacket stepping out from the alley with the other two boys close behind him. Their earlier confidence had returned, but it carried a sharper edge now. The leader stopped several feet away beneath the same street light that illuminated Razor and the Parker brothers. His expression had hardened into something more dangerous than simple pride. "You really think this ends here?" he said slowly. Razor studied him without reacting. The street light revealed the tension in the young man's shoulders and the restless way the other two boys shifted behind him. Lucas leaned slightly closer to Razor. "I saw them earlier tonight," he whispered quietly. "They were behind the old storage building near the railroad tracks. They were breaking into a truck. I think they took something from it." Razor listened carefully without turning his head. The pieces of the situation began to settle into place. The leader heard the whisper as well, and his face tightened with anger. "That is exactly the problem," he snapped. He saw something he should not have seen. Ethan stepped slightly in front of his brother instinctively, though he was far smaller than the youths across the street. Razor gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and guided him back beside Lucas. "You stay close to your brother," he said quietly. The leader took another step forward. His eyes flicked briefly toward the motorcycle and then back to Razor as though measuring the distance between them. "You should have kept riding through town tonight," he said. "You walked into something bigger than you understand." Razor finally took a slow step forward, placing himself squarely between the three youths and the Parker brothers. His posture remained relaxed, but there was no uncertainty in his stance now. "Perhaps," he replied calmly. "But sometimes the only thing a man needs to understand is when someone asks for help." The leader opened his mouth to respond, but another sound suddenly rolled through the quiet street. It began as a distant vibration barely noticeable beneath the night air. Then it grew stronger. A deep mechanical rumble echoed from somewhere down the road leading into Cedar Ridge. Razor recognized the sound instantly. It was the unmistakable thunder of multiple motorcycle engines approaching together. The deep rumble of approaching engines rolled through the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge like distant thunder gathering over the hills. At first it was only a vibration beneath the cold night air, something that made the loose metal sign above the closed gas station tremble slightly. Then the sound grew stronger. Multiple engines moving together. Powerful. Steady. Unmistakable. Daniel Callahan did not even need to turn his head to know exactly what it was. The leader in the red jacket heard it too. His eyes shifted down the road where the sound was coming from. For the first time since stepping out of the alley, his confidence cracked slightly. "What is that?" he muttered under his breath. The two boys behind him exchanged nervous glances. They had grown up around Cedar Ridge. They knew what that sound meant when it came rolling through town late at night. Razor remained calm, standing between the Parker brothers and the three youths with the same quiet patience he had shown since the moment he stepped into the alley. Lucas leaned slightly against him, still breathing carefully to avoid the pain in his ribs. Ethan stood close beside his brother, his small hands clenched tightly in the fabric of Lucas' jacket. The rumble grew louder with every passing second. Headlights appeared at the far end of the street, first one beam, and then several more spreading across the pavement like bright white stars against the darkness. The leader straightened his posture and tried to hide the tension in his voice. "You called someone," he said sharply to Razor. Razor did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down briefly at Ethan and Lucas. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. Neither boy argued. The line of motorcycles turned onto the street leading toward the gas station. Their engines echoed off the closed storefronts and the empty sidewalks. The powerful sound filled the entire block as the riders approached in a slow, controlled formation. Each machine carried the unmistakable deep growl of a large American motorcycle engine. One after another, the headlights swept across the parking lot until the entire area glowed in harsh white light. The riders did not rush. They rolled forward with the calm discipline of men who understood exactly how their presence changed the atmosphere around them. Leather vests and dark jackets caught the light as the motorcycles came to a gradual stop along the edge of the lot. The engines continued to idle, producing a steady mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the pavement. The leader in the red jacket took an involuntary step backward. His eyes moved from one motorcycle to the next as more riders filled the street. The three youths suddenly looked very small beneath the bright lights and the low thunder of the engines. Lucas lifted his head slightly and watched in disbelief. He had never seen so many motorcycles gather in one place outside of a television program. Ethan stared as well, his fear slowly turning into stunned amazement. One of the riders at the front shut off his engine and swung his leg over the seat. The silence that followed felt almost heavier than the noise that came before it. The man walked forward a few steps, the leather vest on his back catching the street light. He looked at Razor first and gave a small nod of recognition before turning his attention toward the three youths standing frozen near the alley. The leader swallowed hard. The earlier anger that filled his voice had vanished completely now. Razor finally spoke again, his calm voice carrying clearly across the quiet lot. "I did not call anyone," he said. "But sometimes when something important happens in a small town, the road has a way of bringing people together." The silence that followed the shutting off of the first motorcycle engine seemed to stretch across the entire parking lot. The remaining motorcycles continued to idle softly, their engines producing a low, steady vibration that rolled across the pavement like distant thunder waiting to break. The man who stepped forward from the line of riders moved with calm confidence. His boots echoed slowly against the asphalt as he approached Daniel Callahan. The street light above the gas station revealed the weathered lines of his face and the heavy leather vest he wore across his broad shoulders. He stopped beside Razor and looked briefly at the Parker brothers standing just behind him. His eyes softened slightly when he saw Lucas leaning against Razor for support and Ethan standing close beside his brother with wide, uncertain eyes. "You found trouble again," Daniel the man said with a quiet half-smile. Razor gave a small nod, but his expression remained serious. "Not looking for it tonight," he replied calmly. "Just answered when someone asked for help." The rider glanced past him toward the three youths standing near the alley entrance. The leader in the red jacket had lost every trace of his earlier confidence. The bright headlights and the presence of so many riders had changed the balance of the moment completely. The two boys behind him shifted uneasily, as if considering whether they should simply run. The rider folded his arms slowly across his chest and studied them. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked in an even voice. No one answered right away. Lucas drew a careful breath and spoke quietly from behind Razor's shoulder. "They attacked me in the alley," he said. "My brother ran for help." Ethan nodded quickly beside him, as if afraid someone might doubt the story. Razor remained still, but the man beside him listened carefully to the words. The leader finally forced himself to speak, though his voice no longer carried the same arrogance it had earlier in the night. "This has nothing to do with you," he said. "It was just a misunderstanding." Razor turned his head slightly toward him. "A misunderstanding does not usually leave someone on the ground struggling to breathe," he replied calmly. The other riders began shutting off their engines one by one. With every engine that fell silent, the quiet in the parking lot grew heavier. Several of the men stepped off their motorcycles and moved closer, forming a loose semicircle that slowly surrounded the scene. None of them spoke, yet their presence alone changed the air around the three youths. The rider beside Razor looked down briefly at Lucas again. "Son, do you need a doctor?" he asked. Lucas nodded weakly. "My ribs hurt when I breathe," he admitted. The rider turned his attention back toward the group by the alley. His voice remained calm, but carried a weight that made the words feel final. "Then the first step tonight is making sure this boy gets help. The rest of this situation can be explained afterward." The leader glanced around at the growing circle of riders. The path behind him toward the alley suddenly looked much darker and far less safe than the open street ahead. Razor noticed the hesitation and spoke quietly to Lucas and Ethan. "You two stay close to the motorcycle. We will get you home soon." Ethan looked up at him with gratitude shining through the fear still lingering in his eyes. Lucas gave a small nod as well. As the brothers moved slowly toward the motorcycle, the riders continued to stand watch. The leader in the red jacket stared at Razor one last time, as though realizing the night had slipped completely beyond his control. The calm biker who had stepped into the alley alone had somehow turned the entire street into a place where the truth could no longer hide. The quiet of the parking lot settled into a tense stillness as the last motorcycle engine fell silent. What remained was the faint ticking of hot metal cooling under the night air and the distant whisper of wind moving through the empty street. Lucas Parker leaned carefully against the seat of the large motorcycle, while Ethan stood close beside him, one hand gripping the edge of his brother's jacket, as though afraid the moment might still vanish if he let go. Daniel Callahan remained a few steps ahead of them, his broad frame steady and unmoving as he faced the three youths near the alley. Around him, the other riders stood in a loose semicircle, their calm presence filling the space with quiet authority. No one raised their voice. No one rushed forward. Yet the meaning of their presence was unmistakable. The man who had stepped forward earlier looked again toward Lucas and Ethan to make certain the boys were safe before turning his attention back to the three youths. The leader in the red jacket shifted his weight nervously under the street light. The bright glare made it impossible for him to hide the tension that now lined his face. His two companions stood slightly behind him, both looking as though they wished the night would simply end so they could disappear back into the darkness of the alley. The rider folded his arms slowly across his chest. "Son," he said calmly to the leader, "this town is small. People notice things. So let us try again. Why was that boy lying on the pavement when this man walked into the alley?" The leader hesitated. His eyes flicked toward Razor and then toward the line of motorcycles behind him. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked unsure of every choice he might make next. "It was nothing," he muttered finally. "Just a misunderstanding that got out of hand." Razor tilted his head slightly, as though considering the answer. Lucas' voice came quietly from beside the motorcycle. "It was not a misunderstanding," he said carefully. "They were behind the old storage building near the railroad tracks. They were breaking open the back of a delivery truck. I saw them pulling boxes out." Ethan nodded beside him. "I saw it too," he added quickly, though his voice trembled. The leader glared at the brothers, but the anger in his eyes had begun to fade into something closer to worry. One of the riders near the edge of the group spoke for the first time. "A delivery truck, you say? That sounds like something the county sheriff might want to hear about." The words hung in the air like a quiet bell ringing across the empty street. The leader swallowed hard. His earlier bravado had vanished completely now. "You do not need to call anyone," he said quickly. Razor looked at him with calm patience. "Sometimes when people make bad choices, the best thing they can do next is stop making them," he replied. The rider who had first approached Razor turned slightly and gestured toward the motorcycle where Lucas rested. "We should take care of the injured boy first," he said. "The rest can wait." Razor nodded once in agreement. He walked back to the motorcycle and crouched slightly beside Lucas. "How are the ribs feeling now?" he asked. Lucas winced slightly, but managed a small nod. "I can breathe a little better," he said, though the movement still hurt. Razor stood again and looked toward the group of riders. "We need to get him to a clinic," he said. One of the riders stepped forward immediately. "I know a doctor 2 blocks from here," he replied. "He keeps late hours." As Razor helped Lucas carefully toward the waiting motorcycles, Ethan walked beside them, glancing back once more toward the 3 youths still standing beneath the street light. For the first time since the night began, the leader in the red jacket said nothing at all. The truth had finally caught up with him under the quiet watch of the road. The motorcycles rolled slowly through the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge, their engines now softer and controlled as the riders guided the group toward the small clinic located near the center of town. Daniel Callahan rode at the front while another rider carefully helped Lucas Parker sit behind him, making sure the injured boy held on safely without placing pressure on his ribs. Ethan rode with one of the other bikers, his small hands gripping the sides of the seat as he looked around with wide eyes at the line of motorcycles surrounding him like a moving shield through the silent town. The streets were nearly empty at that hour. A few porch lights glowed faintly along the sidewalks while the distant hum of highway traffic drifted across the dark hills beyond Cedar Ridge. Within a few minutes, the group turned onto a narrow street where a modest brick building stood with a single light shining through the front window. A small wooden sign near the door read Cedar Ridge Family Clinic. One of the riders shut off his engine and stepped forward to knock on the door while the others parked along the curb. Razor helped Lucas carefully off the motorcycle, keeping one steady arm around the boy as they walked slowly toward the entrance. Ethan jumped down from the other bike and hurried to his brother's side. "I am right here, Lucas," he said quietly. Lucas managed a tired smile. "I know you are." The door opened a moment later and a middle-aged doctor wearing a gray sweater looked out with surprise at the unexpected gathering of motorcycles outside his clinic. Then he noticed the injured boy and his expression changed immediately. "Bring him inside," he said quickly, stepping aside to make room. Lucas was guided carefully into the small examination room where the doctor began checking his breathing and gently pressing along his ribs to locate the injury. Razor and Ethan waited nearby while the doctor worked. After a few careful minutes, the doctor nodded reassuringly. "I do not believe any ribs are broken," he said. "They are bruised badly, but he will recover with rest." Relief washed across Ethan's face so quickly that it was almost visible. Lucas let out a slow breath as the tension in his shoulders eased for the first time since the attack in the alley. Razor gave a quiet nod of thanks to the doctor. Outside the clinic, the other riders remained near their motorcycles, watching the quiet street. The man who had first spoken beside Razor earlier stepped away from the group and looked down the road toward the direction of the gas station. "Those boys back there will not simply forget tonight," he said quietly when Razor joined him a moment later. Razor folded his arms and looked out at the sleeping town. "No," he replied calmly. "But tonight they learned something important." The rider glanced at him. "What is that?" Razor watched the dim street lights stretching into the distance before answering. "That this town does not belong to fear." Inside the clinic, Ethan sat beside his brother on the small examination bed while the doctor wrapped a bandage around Lucas' ribs to support the bruised muscles. Ethan looked up as Razor stepped back into the room. "Thank you for helping us," he said softly. Razor shook his head slightly. "You were the one who asked for help," he replied. "That is the bravest thing someone can do." Lucas nodded slowly as he adjusted the bandage around his ribs. "I thought nobody would come," he admitted. Razor looked at both brothers for a moment before speaking again. "Someone always comes when the road is still open," he said quietly. Outside the clinic, the motorcycles waited beneath the soft glow of the street lights, silent now, but ready to ride again when the night finally moved on. The quiet room inside Cedar Ridge Family Clinic carried the soft smell of antiseptic and warm light from the ceiling lamps. Lucas Parker sat carefully on the edge of the examination bed while the doctor finished adjusting the support bandage around his ribs. Ethan remained close beside him, his shoulders finally relaxing now that the pain in his brother's face had begun to ease. Daniel Callahan stood near the doorway, giving the boys space while watching the small scene with quiet patience. The doctor stepped back and nodded once more. "You were fortunate tonight," he said gently to Lucas. "Bruised ribs can be painful, but they will heal. The most important thing now is rest and avoiding any sudden movement." Lucas nodded gratefully. "Thank you, doctor," he said. Ethan looked at his brother, as if still making sure the danger had truly passed. For several seconds neither boy spoke. The events of the night had happened so quickly that it was only now inside the safe walls of the clinic that their bodies seemed to understand they were no longer in danger. Outside the front window, the motorcycles remained lined along the curb beneath the street lights. The riders waited calmly, speaking in low voices while keeping watch over the quiet street. Razor stepped outside after the doctor finished and closed the clinic door gently behind him. The cool night air greeted him again as he walked toward the group. The man who had spoken earlier leaned against his motorcycle with his arms folded loosely across his chest. He looked up as Razor approached. "How is the boy?" he asked. Razor gave a small nod. "Bruised ribs, but nothing broken. He will recover." The rider exhaled slowly with relief. "That is good to hear." For a moment, both men stood quietly while the rest of the riders remained nearby. The town of Cedar Ridge slept peacefully around them, unaware that a violent moment had nearly unfolded in one of its dark alleys earlier that night. Razor looked down the empty street toward the direction of the gas station where the confrontation had begun. The memory of the three youths standing under the street light still lingered in his mind. "They will think twice before repeating what they did tonight," the rider beside him said quietly. Razor remained thoughtful for a moment before answering. "Perhaps," he replied. "But fear alone rarely changes a man for long." The rider glanced at him curiously. "Then what does?" Razor looked back toward the clinic window where Ethan could be seen sitting beside Lucas, talking quietly while the doctor wrote a few notes at his desk. "Sometimes all it takes is one moment where someone chooses to stand between danger and the people who cannot stand alone," he said. The rider followed his gaze toward the window. "That boy did the same thing tonight," he said. "He ran for help instead of hiding." Razor nodded once. "Courage does not always look the way people expect," he replied. Inside the clinic, Ethan noticed Razor through the glass and raised a small hand in quiet gratitude. Lucas gave a tired wave as well. Razor returned the gesture with a calm nod before turning back toward the motorcycles. The night was slowly moving forward, and the town would wake again in a few hours to another ordinary morning. Yet for two young brothers and one quiet biker, the memory of this night would remain long after the streets of Cedar Ridge forgot the sound of engines that had gathered under its street lights. The night over Cedar Ridge had grown quieter than before as the final moments of tension slowly faded into the calm rhythm of a small town nearing morning. Inside Cedar Ridge Family Clinic, the soft light above the examination bed still glowed warmly, while Lucas Parker sat carefully upright with the support bandage wrapped around his ribs. The pain had not disappeared, but it had softened enough that he could breathe more comfortably. Ethan sat beside him on the edge of the bed, his earlier fear now replaced by relief that spread across his young face every time he looked at his brother. The doctor finished writing his notes and turned back toward the boys with a gentle smile. "You both did the right thing tonight," he said quietly. "Getting help quickly can make all the difference." Lucas nodded while Ethan gave a small but proud smile. Daniel Callahan stood near the doorway listening without interrupting. He had always preferred the quiet part of a story after the storm had passed. The doctor stepped closer and handed Lucas a small paper with instructions for rest and recovery. "You should avoid any heavy activity for a few weeks," he explained calmly. "Let the bruising heal and your strength will return." Lucas thanked him again before slowly standing. Razor stepped forward and offered a steady arm to help him walk toward the door. Ethan moved quickly to the other side, as if determined that his brother would never walk alone again. When the clinic door opened, the cool night air greeted them once more. Outside, the line of motorcycles still rested under the street lights like silent guardians watching over the quiet street. Several of the riders straightened when they saw the boys emerge safely. The man who had spoken earlier gave a small nod of approval. "Lucas looks stronger already," he said. Razor helped Lucas sit carefully on the low step outside the clinic, while Ethan remained beside him. For a moment no one spoke. The peaceful silence of the street carried the gentle hum of distant power lines and the faint rustle of leaves moving through the night breeze. Lucas looked up at Razor with honest gratitude in his eyes. "I will never forget what you did for us tonight," he said quietly. Ethan nodded quickly beside him. "I thought no one would help when I ran into the street," he added. Razor shook his head slightly. "Sometimes help arrives in ways people do not expect," he replied calmly. The rider who had been standing beside the motorcycle stepped forward again. "The sheriff will likely hear about what happened near the storage building," he said. "When that happens, the truth about those boys will come out." Razor looked down the quiet street toward the direction of the railroad tracks where the trouble had begun earlier that night. "The road has a way of carrying the truth where it needs to go," he said softly. After a few more minutes, Lucas felt strong enough to stand again. One of the riders offered to drive the brothers home, while the rest of the group prepared their motorcycles for the road ahead. Ethan climbed carefully onto the back seat while Lucas held on in front of him, both boys now safe and protected by the quiet strength surrounding them. Before the engine started, Razor gave them a final nod. "Take care of each other," he said. Ethan smiled and raised his hand in a small wave. Lucas returned the gesture with deep gratitude. Then one by one the motorcycle engines came to life again, filling the silent street with a powerful but steady sound. The riders turned their machines toward the open highway beyond Cedar Ridge. Within moments, the line of motorcycles rolled away into the night, leaving only the fading echo of engines and the memory of a moment when courage and compassion met on a quiet American street. For the Parker brothers, the lesson of that night would stay with them for the rest of their lives. When fear appears without warning, sometimes all it takes is one brave voice asking for help and one steady heart willing to answer.